The shrill ringing of my phone jolted me awake from a deep slumber. Instinctively, I reached for it, squinting at the caller ID. Micah. A knot formed in my stomach as I answered, bracing myself for the worst. "Mom, I'm so sorry to call this late, but I need to ask you something important." Micah's voice trembled. "Can you please increase my allowance? Living on $10 a month is impossible." My heart sank as confusion washed over me. $10 a month? Micah, that can't be right. I've been depositing $200 every month into your account without fail. Silence hung heavy between us, punctuated only by Micah's shaky breaths. "Mom, I don't know what to say. I've been struggling to make ends meet, working odd jobs just to afford basic necessities." Guilt and determination surged within me. "Stay put, honey. I'll be right there." I ended the call and scrambled to get ready, my mind racing with unanswered questions. The drive to Micah's apartment seemed endless, each red light amplifying my worry. When I finally arrived, the sight that greeted me was gut-wrenching. My son, once vibrant and full of life, now appeared gaunt and hollow-eyed, his tiny studio apartment devoid of warmth. "Micah," I choked back tears, enveloping him in a tight embrace. "Why didn't you tell me things were this bad?" He clung to me, his body trembling. "I didn't want to burden you, Mom. You work so hard already." Anger bubbled up inside me, directed at whoever was responsible for this injustice. I immediately withdrew a substantial amount of cash from the nearest ATM, pressing it into Micah's hands. "This should tide you over for now. I promise we'll get to the bottom of this mess." As I held my son close, determination burned within me. Someone had betrayed our trust, and I would stop at nothing to uncover the truth and make things right again. After the initial shock of seeing Micah's living conditions, I wasted no time. We bundled up and drove straight to my place, my mind consumed with outrage and determination to solve this injustice. As soon as we stepped inside, I ushered Micah to the kitchen and whipped up a hearty meal, watching him devour it ravenously. Each mouthful seemed to breathe life back into his sunken cheeks, and a glimmer of hope flickered in his eyes. Once he'd finished, I poured us both a glass of water and sat across from him, steeling myself for the tough conversation ahead. "Micah, I need you to tell me everything. When did you first notice something was off with your allowance?" He took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the table. "A few months ago, the deposits just stopped coming. At first, I thought it might be a glitch or a missed payment, but when it kept happening, I knew something was seriously wrong." Anger coiled inside me like a viper, ready to strike. "And you never thought to let me know?" "Honey, you should have come to me sooner." Micah's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I didn't want to add to your stress, Mom. You work such long hours at the hospital. I thought I could handle it on my own, but—" His voice cracked, and he buried his face in his hands. Instinctively, I reached across the table and gripped his hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "It's going to be okay, Micah. We'll figure this out together." He nodded, visibly trying to compose himself. "I've been taking any job I can find. Waiting tables, delivering food, even tutoring, but it's never enough to cover rent, utilities, and basic expenses." White-hot rage coursed through my veins at the thought of my son, my brilliant, hard-working son, being forced to sacrifice his education and well-being because of someone else's deceit. Pushing away from the table, I paced the kitchen, my mind racing. "Micah, I want you to pack a bag and stay here with me until we resolve this mess." "No arguments," I added firmly, cutting off his protests. "And first thing tomorrow, I'm going to have a little chat with your father." The mere thought of confronting Jake twisted my stomach into knots, but I couldn't back down now. Not when my son's future was on the line. If Jake was behind this, he would face the full force of my wrath, and I wouldn't stop until justice was served. After ensuring Micah was settled in the guest room, I marched straight into the bedroom I shared with Jake, determination fueling my every step. He was lounging on the bed, mindlessly flipping through channels on the TV. "Jake, we need to talk. Now." My tone brooked no argument. He glanced up, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What's got you so riled up?" I took a deep breath, struggling to keep my anger in check. "Care to explain why our son has been living like a pauper for months while you've been pocketing the money I've been sending him?" Jake's eyes widened, and he sat up straighter. Whoa, slow down. What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb with me," I snapped, Micah called me in tears tonight, saying he's been surviving on scraps because his allowance stopped coming through. A flicker of guilt crossed Jake's face before it hardened into a mask of indifference. So you finally gave him his allowance? About time. Don't forget next month. His cavalier attitude was like a slap in the face, and I saw red. What is wrong with you? Our son has been struggling to afford basic necessities, and you're acting like it's no big deal? Jake rolled his eyes, rising from the bed. Don't be so dramatic, Emma. He's a grown man. He can take care of himself. His dismissive tone ignited a fury within me I'd never experienced before. I stepped closer, jabbing a finger into his chest. This behavior is unacceptable, Jake. You're his father, for God's sake. How could you let this happen? For a moment, he seemed taken aback by my intensity. But then his expression contorted into a sneer that chilled me to the bone. Back off, Emma. You're making a big deal out of nothing. Before I could respond, my gaze fell upon a glittering object on the nightstand. A gaudy, decorative keychain I'd never seen before. A sick feeling settled in the pit of my stomach as I realized this keepsake didn't belong to either of us. Jake followed my line of sight and quickly snatched up the keychain, shoving it into his pocket. But it was too late. The seed of doubt had been planted. Where did you get that? I demanded, my voice low and dangerous. Jake's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. It's nothing, just a little gift for myself. Lies. More lies. The betrayal stung like acid, searing through the very fabric of our marriage vows. In that moment, I knew. I couldn't trust a word that came out of his mouth. My husband, the man I'd loved and built a life with, was hiding something sinister, and I wouldn't rest until I uncovered every last sordid detail. The next morning, I woke up feeling drained and disoriented, as if the events of the previous night had been nothing more than a twisted nightmare. But the empty space beside me in bed was a harsh reminder that this was my new reality. Pushing aside the blankets, I padded into the living room, where Micah was already up, clutching a mug of coffee like a lifeline. Morning, honey, I greeted, forcing a smile. Did you sleep okay? He nodded silently, his eyes haunted. We both knew there was an elephant in the room, a looming confrontation that could shatter what remained of our family. Swallowing hard, I reached for my phone. I'm going to call your Uncle Mark. He works at the bank. Maybe he can shed some light on what's going on with your accounts. Relief washed over Micah's face, and he visibly relaxed. Mark had always been a steady, trustworthy presence in our lives, the polar opposite of his brother Jake. Within the hour, Mark arrived at our doorstep, pulling me into a comforting hug before greeting Micah warmly. So, fill me in on what's happening, he said, his brow furrowed with concern. I launched into an explanation, laying out the facts as calmly as I could, but as the words tumbled out, anger and hurt seeped into my tone. Mark listened patiently, nodding along. That doesn't sound like Jake at all, he mused. Let me look into Micah's accounts and see if there are any discrepancies. While Mark made some calls, I busied myself in the kitchen, trying to keep my mind occupied. But it was no use. A nagging voice in the back of my head kept whispering that something was very, very wrong. Finally, Mark emerged, his expression grave. Emma, you're not going to like this. My heart plummeted as he explained that there were, in fact, 2 accounts listed under Micah's name. A primary account that I was depositing into, and a secondary one that had been draining funds for months. But how is that possible? I demanded, struggling to make sense of it all. Mark's jaw tightened. Jake set up the second account without your knowledge. He's been siphoning money from the primary into that separate fund. White-hot rage surged through me, quickly followed by a wave of icy betrayal. Jake had been lying to me all along, stealing from our own son for God knows what reason. That bastard, I hissed, slamming my fist onto the counter. Micah flinched, his eyes wide with worry. Mark placed a calming hand on my shoulder. I know this is a lot to take in, but we need to stay focused and get to the bottom of this. Taking a deep, steadying breath, I nodded. You're right. Do you think we should hire a private investigator to dig deeper and find out what Jake's really been up to? The words tasted bitter on my tongue, but I knew it was the only way. If Jake was leading a double life, I needed to uncover every last sordid detail, no matter how painful it might be. As Mark made arrangements, I pulled Micah aside, my heart aching for the turmoil he'd endured. I'm so sorry you got caught up in this mess, honey, I murmured, cupping his face in my hands. But I promise you, we're going to make things right. Your dad is going to face the consequences of his actions. Micah nodded solemnly, his eyes shining with a mixture of sadness and resolve. In that moment, I vowed to myself that I would stop at nothing to protect him, even if it meant unleashing the full force of my wrath on the man I once loved. The days that followed were a blur of anxiety and anticipation as we waited for the private investigator to uncover Jake's secrets. The uneasy silence that lingered in our home was suffocating, punctuated only by the occasional reassuring squeeze of Micah's hand. Finally, the investigator requested to meet us, promising he had uncovered crucial information. Mark offered to join us for moral support, and we convened at a local diner, our nerves frayed. The investigator wasted no time getting to the point. Mrs. Thompson, I'm afraid the news I have is disturbing, to say the least. My heart pounded in my ears as he continued. Your husband, Jake, has been involved in an extramarital affair for quite some time now, with a woman named Sasha, nearly 15 years his junior. A collective gasp rippled through our group, but the investigator pressed on, his expression grim. That's not all. It appears Jake has been funneling money, your son's allowance, to be precise, into a separate account, which he then used to lavish expensive gifts and nights out on this Sasha. My vision blurred with hot, angry tears as the pieces finally clicked into place. The secret bank account, the unexplained keepsake, Jake's hostility, it all made sense now. He had been cheating on me, stealing from our own child to fund his sordid double life. That low-life scumbag, Mark snarled, his hands curled into tight fists. How could he do this to his own family? I opened my mouth to respond, but the words stuck in my throat, choked by the overwhelming sense of betrayal. Instead, I turned to Micah, who sat frozen in stunned silence, his face drained of color. Honey, I'm so sorry, I rasped, reaching across the table to grasp his hand. None of this is your fault. Micah blinked rapidly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I can't believe Dad would, how could he? His voice trailed off, and in that moment I felt a surge of white-hot rage unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. Jake had not only shattered the sacred vows of our marriage, but had also inflicted unimaginable pain on our son, the one person who should have been able to trust him implicitly. Squeezing Micah's hand tightly, I turned to the investigator with a steely resolve. Thank you for your work on this. I know exactly what needs to be done now. As we stood to leave, Mark pulled me aside, his expression a mixture of concern and support. Emma, whatever you decide to do next, I've got your back. That snake doesn't deserve a shred of mercy after what he's put you both through. I nodded, my jaw set in grim determination. Jake's web of lies and deceit had finally been exposed, and there would be no escape from the reckoning that awaited him. It was time to gather our families and face him head-on, leaving no room for excuses or manipulation. This was the moment I had been preparing for, the chance to unleash the full force of my wrath and ensure that Jake faced the consequences of his despicable actions. And as Micah and I walked out into the warm afternoon sun, I silently vowed that justice would be served, no matter what it took. The air was thick with tension as our families gathered in the living room, their expressions ranging from confusion to outright hostility. Jake sat apart from the group, his face a mask of forced nonchalance that did little to conceal the anxiety simmering beneath the surface. As I paced before them, clutching the damning evidence in my trembling hands, an eerie hush fell over the room. All eyes were fixed on me, awaiting the bombshell I was about to drop. Thank you all for coming, I began, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside me. I've called you here today because it's time Jake's deceit and betrayal were brought to light. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd, but a sharp look from my father quickly silenced them. Squaring my shoulders, I turned to face Jake head-on. Jake, you've been having an affair with a woman named Sasha, and to fund your sordid little tryst, you've been stealing from our son, Micah, embezzling the money I've been sending him for his allowance and living expenses. The words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, Jake's expression remained impassive. But then, his mask began to crack, twisting into a sneer of defiance. You've got no proof of any of that, he spat. his eyes darting around the room as if seeking an ally. But I was ready, brandishing the stack of evidence like a weapon. "Oh, but I do. Bank statements, receipts for expensive gifts and hotel stays, all traced back to you and your little mistress." Jake's face drained of color as I methodically laid out every sordid detail, leaving no room for doubt or excuses. Beside me, Micah sat rigid, his hands clenched into tight fists as the full extent of his father's betrayal sank in. As the last damning piece of evidence was revealed, a hush fell over the room, punctuated only by the sound of Jake's ragged breathing. It was as if the air had been sucked out, leaving us all gasping for oxygen in the wake of such staggering deception. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A petite woman with heavily made-up features slinking towards the center of the room. Sasha, the woman who had so callously inserted herself into our lives and torn our family apart. Well, it seems the jig is up," she purred, her voice dripping with false sweetness as she sidled up to Jake. "Did you really think you could keep me a secret forever, darling?" Jake recoiled from her touch, his face contorted in a mixture of anger and shame. "Sasha, what are you doing here?" But she merely laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Oh, Jake, you're just too easy. Did you really think I loved you? That this was anything more than a means to an end?" The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of my mother's muffled sobs. Jake sat frozen, his mouth hanging open in a twisted parody of shock and anguish. You used me?" he croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sasha rolled her eyes, examining her perfectly manicured nails with a bored expression. "Of course I did, you idiot. Did you really think a woman like me would settle for a pathetic loser like you if there wasn't something in it for me?" Her words cut deeper than any knife, and I could see the fight draining from Jake's body with every venomous syllable. In that moment, he was utterly broken. A shell of the man I had once loved, stripped bare by the very woman he had sacrificed everything for. As Sasha sauntered out, leaving a trail of devastation in her wake, an eerie silence descended upon the room. Jake remained motionless, his gaze fixed on some distant point as the weight of his actions finally came crashing down around him. It was over. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no turning back. All that remained was to pick up the pieces and begin the long, arduous process of healing. A journey that would test the limits of our strength and resolve, but one that we would undertake together, united in our determination to overcome the betrayal that had nearly torn us apart. The silence that hung in the air was suffocating, broken only by the occasional muffled sob or sharp intake of breath. Jake sat hunched in his chair, his head cradled in his hands as the full weight of his deception bore down upon him. Beside me, Micah shifted uncomfortably, his jaw clenched tight as he struggled to process the avalanche of revelations. I reached out and gave his hand a reassuring squeeze, drawing strength from his presence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jake lifted his head, his eyes rimmed with unshed tears. "Emma, His voice cracked and he swallowed hard. "I don't know what to say." The apology died on his lips as my father abruptly rose from his seat, his face thunderous. "Save it, Jake," he growled. "Your actions speak louder than any words ever could." Jake flinched as if he'd been physically struck, his gaze dropping to the floor in shame. Seizing the opportunity, I stepped forward, unfurling the divorce papers I'd had drawn up. "These are standard divorce proceedings," I stated, my tone clipped and businesslike. "You'll also be responsible for compensating Micah for the full amount you embezzled from his accounts, plus interest." A collective murmur rippled through the room, but I held up a hand, silencing them. "I'm also seeking additional damages for the emotional turmoil and distress you've put us through." Jake's head snapped up, his eyes widening in disbelief. "Emma, you can't be serious." But I was deadly serious. This man, this stranger who had once been my husband, had shattered our family's trust in the most despicable way imaginable. He deserved no mercy, no second chances. "Sign the papers, Jake," I said, my voice laced with steel. "It's the only way to begin making amends for what you've done." For a long moment he simply stared at me, as if willing me to back down or offer him a lifeline. But when none came, his shoulders slumped in defeat. With trembling hands, he reached for the pen and scrawled his signature across the dotted line, sealing his fate. As the papers were shuffled and handed off to my lawyer, a heavy silence descended upon the room once more. Jake remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the floor as the weight of his actions finally sank in. It was then that a commotion erupted from the hallway, the unmistakable sounds of angry shouting and scuffling. Before anyone could react, Sasha burst through the door, her perfectly coiffed hair in disarray and makeup smeared. "You lying, cheating scumbag!" she screeched, her eyes wild and accusing as she zeroed in on Jake. "You told me you were some hotshot CEO, not some washed-up loser living off his wife's income." Jake recoiled as if he'd been struck, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly as Sasha advanced on him, her manicured nails bared like claws. "I can't believe I let you touch me, let alone waste my time and money on you," she spat, her words dripping with venom. "You're nothing but a pathetic, spineless excuse for a man." With each blistering insult, Jake seemed to shrink further into himself, his facade of bravado crumbling under the onslaught of Sasha's fury. As the rest of us looked on in stunned silence, Sasha whirled on her heel and stormed out, leaving a trail of destruction in her wake. Jake remained frozen, his eyes glassy and unfocused, as if he'd finally glimpsed the depths of his own depravity. In that moment, I felt a strange sense of pity wash over me. This broken, pathetic shell of a man was barely recognizable as the person I had once loved and built a life with. His betrayal had been unforgivable, but in the end, he was the architect of his own downfall. A cautionary tale of what happens when greed and lust are allowed to fester unchecked. As my family members began to disperse, offering murmured words of support and consolation, I turned to Micah, my heart swelling with a renewed sense of purpose. "It's over," I said softly, brushing a stray tear from his cheek. "Your dad's lies and deceit have finally caught up to him. Now it's time for us to start fresh, to rebuild and move forward, stronger than ever before." Micah nodded, his expression a mix of sadness and determination. We had endured the unimaginable, but our bond had only grown stronger in the face of such adversity. As we turned and walked out into the crisp evening air, I knew that while the road ahead would be long and challenging, we would tackle it together, side by side, a united front, forged in the fires of betrayal and tempered by an unshakable resilience that no force on earth could break. In the weeks that followed, Jake's world unraveled at a dizzying pace. The fallout from his sordid affair and financial misdeeds proved to be a maelstrom from which there was no escape. My lawyer wasted no time in pursuing the compensation and damages outlined in the divorce papers. With irrefutable evidence of his embezzlement and betrayal, Jake had no choice but to comply, a fact that left him seething with impotent rage. "This is highway robbery," he raged one day, slamming his fist on the table as we finalized the transfer of funds to cover Micah's losses. "You're bleeding me dry, Emma." I leveled him with an icy glare, unfazed by his outburst. "You brought this on yourself, Jake? Consider this a mere fraction of the price you'll pay for your despicable actions." His face flushed an ugly shade of crimson, but he knew better than to argue. With each dollar he was forced to relinquish, I could see the fight draining from his eyes, replaced by a weary resignation. As if the financial burden wasn't enough, Jake's professional life soon crumbled as well. News of his infidelity and fraudulent activities quickly spread through the company grapevine, and before long he found himself unceremoniously dismissed. A disgraced pariah in the industry he had once thrived in. "They can't do this to me," he blustered, pacing the living room in a frenzy. "I built that company from the ground up. Those ungrateful bastards owe me." But his protests fell on deaf ears. The corporate world had no tolerance for the kind of moral bankruptcy he had displayed, and he soon found himself blacklisted, his once promising career reduced to ashes. As Jake's life spiraled further into disarray, Sasha wasted no time in cutting her losses and fleeing town, her appetite for drama and chaos finally sated. But not before my legal team ensured she faced the consequences of her actions, too. "You really thought you could just waltz in, ruin my family, and walk away scot-free?" I challenged her during one particularly heated confrontation. Sasha merely shrugged, examining her perfectly manicured nails with a bored expression. "It was fun while it lasted, I guess. But Jake was never really my type. Too clingy, too desperate." Her callous indifference was maddening, but I refused to let her get under my skin. Well, I hope you enjoyed your little game, because you're about to pay the price. True to my word, Sasha found herself embroiled in a legal quagmire that left her finances in tatters. Any ill-gotten gains she had acquired through her dalliance with Jake were swiftly clawed back, leaving her to slink away in disgrace, her reputation in ruins. As the dust settled and a sense of normalcy began to return, I found myself reflecting on the tumultuous journey that had brought us to this point. The road had been paved with heartbreak and betrayal, but we had emerged from the flames tempered and stronger than ever before. Micah, in particular, seemed to thrive in the aftermath of his father's downfall. With the financial burden lifted and a renewed sense of purpose, he poured himself into his studies, ultimately landing a coveted job at a prestigious firm upon graduation. As for me, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and accomplishment. I had stared down the face of adversity and emerged victorious, my unwavering determination to protect my family proving to be an unbreakable force. And yet, amid the triumphs and hard-won victories, there was still a lingering ache, a reminder of the love and trust that had been so callously shattered. Jake's actions had left scars that would never fully heal, a constant reminder of the fragility of the bonds we once thought unbreakable. But as I watched Micah thriving in his new life, surrounded by a supportive network of friends and colleagues, I knew that we had weathered the storm. We had faced the darkness head-on and emerged into the light, our resilience and love for one another shining brighter than ever before. And in that moment, I silently vowed to never lose sight of the hard-won wisdom we had gained. That true strength lies not in the absence of adversity, but in the courage to face it head-on and emerge stronger on the other side.